So we have officially entered the year of 2024, which means we are inching closer to Final Fantasy VII Rebirth. And of course, that hype train just keeps on coming through. And today we're going to talk about a specific word from Naoki Hamaguchi that kind of has some fans very intrigued in how it could pertain to Final Fantasy VII Remake Part 3. And then we're going to take a look at today's Game Informer article focusing specifically on the character of Dyne. So if any of that sounds cool to you, feel free to click the like button. And if you're new here and you'd like to stick around, you can subscribe as well. It is always appreciated. So first off, now that we are finally in January, I hope that means that long-rumored Final Fantasy VII Rebirth demo, the one that takes place during the Nibelheim flashback, will hopefully be hitting us sometime this month. Again, Square Enix likes to release demos for their games about a month in advance to kind of build up the hype and marketing for the game. They did it for Final Fantasy VII Remake as well as Final Fantasy XVI, so hopefully someday soon we'll get word on that potential demo. Seemingly everyone and their mom at this point has played it, and I think it's time for us normies to play it as well. And should that demo hit this month, I'll be doing a playthrough of it and putting it up here on the channel, and if you're interested, you can check it out. Now, moving on to those very interesting interviews that Famitsu does at the end of every single year, they sit down with a bunch of Japanese developers and just kind of interview them on their outlook for the upcoming year, and it's usually a quick few blurbs from them and some aspirations and some keynotes. And Naoki Hamaguchi was one of the developers interviewed. Now, this translation comes to us from Audrey on Twitter, so thank you to her for translating it for us, but his specific keyword is the word revival, which the moment that hit, a lot of people were thinking, could that pertain to Remake Part 3? Is that going to be the official subtitle for that game? Personally, I don't think it is. I would be okay with it being called Revival. It follows the naming convention they have with Remake and Rebirth, and it honestly sounds pretty cool, but I don't think Square Enix would just be okay with Naoki Hamaguchi just throwing out the subtitle for Final Fantasy VII Remake Part 3 in a Famitsu interview. So it could potentially be related to the word revival and not revival itself. A lot of us thought that Reunion could be the name of the third game, but they've already used that for Crisis Core, and using it a second time just might be a little confusing and redundant. Or they could just follow what the Matrix movies did and call it Final Fantasy VII Revelations if they want to do that. But I just thought that was pretty interesting that he threw that word specifically out there, because now once we do discover what the subtitle for the game is, it should inform us on the story stuff of Remake Part 3 and what that could consist of. And just a quick little side note, the producer for Virtua Fighter was also included in this year-end review from Famitsu, and that is Mr. Aoki, and his specific keyword was new challenger, and his personal aspirations was just the letters VF, which hopefully means that sometime this year we'll get an announcement for a brand new Virtua Fighter. It's the right time to do it. People want a new Virtua Fighter, and fighting games are doing really well right now. We've got Tekken 8 on the horizon, Street Fighter 6 came out and did really well, Mortal Kombat's doing really well, the new Grand Blue looks pretty cool, so now is the perfect time to bring back Virtua Fighter and try to do something maybe a little different with it. Now, getting to this Game Informer article, again, first and foremost, this will be dealing with a lot of spoilers in regards to the original FF7 as well as Rebirth. So again, if you are new here and you haven't played the OG game and you're new with Final Fantasy VII Remake and that was your first one, there's massive spoilers moving forward, so you've been warned, just a heads up. But for today's article, this comes to us again from Game Informer, and they got to sit down with Yoshinori Kitase, Tetsuya Nomura, and Naoki Hamaguchi to talk to them about adding more impact and emotion and depth, and they're focusing specifically on the Corel prison and the character of Dyne. So starting off first with Nomura, he goes on to say, when the remake project was first decided, we already felt that if we were going to take on this series, it's imperative that we depict the characters much more deeply and go into more depth in approaching them. Not only Aerith's arc for Rebirth, but even other characters like Dyne, for example. I really wanted to show in a more detailed way for Rebirth. There's a scene where I truly want to cry when I see it. And then Hamaguchi also chimes in saying, oh yes, that scene with Dyne is a great one. It might be one of the top most wonderful scenes. And in terms of adding more character and depth and emotion, that's something that the developers have really been talking about a lot when it comes to Rebirth, and they've really been hammering that home. And I think they've been doing a really great job of that so far. You look at Remake and the characters all feel like fleshed out characters that are going to have big arcs. No one really feels like a cardboard cutout or some sort of weird stereotype. Everyone has different layers to them. And that's something that is very important, especially since this is going to be a trilogy. It's not just going to be a one game kind of situation. You need to be able to build arcs for these characters and flesh that out over those 3 games to keep people invested. And I think one of the best examples of that is the character of Barret. You see him at first and you think he's just this big, loudmouth, angry guy, but the more layers that peel back with Barret, you discover that he really is just kind of a big teddy bear. He's a very protective person who cares about the people around him, and Avalanche, his, adopted daughter of Marlene, and protecting the planet. And there's so many scenes in that game where he gets emotional and just kind of shares his thoughts and his feelings with the people around him, and he really opens up. And I think that's a really prime example of just how great of a job they've been doing adding so much more depth and emotion to these characters. So that way when the big moments involving those characters do happen, it will hit harder. And again, like we covered in the previous video with Aerith, I think that moment when she does die, if she does die, will hit just as hard, if not harder, than the original, because they've been building her up so much and she's been voiced wonderfully by Brianna White. So there's so many things that go into adding the emotion and impact, but they're definitely doing that, and they're doing a great job of doing so. Nomura continues by saying, within Rebirth, the characters that we have all come to know and love are depicted quite fully and in depth. For me, that character from Corel Prison was quite memorable. I'm not sure if players remember him, but everywhere players go, there will be characters like that who we remember from the original game that are depicted in more detail. And obviously he's talking about Dyne there, which I think everyone pretty much remembers. And I think other than Aerith's death in the original FF7, you could argue that the next most heartbreaking moment in that game is the character of Dyne and his entire character arc and what he goes through and just how broken of a man he actually is. What's really interesting is that Kitase follows up by saying that he didn't know if Dyne and his arc was even going to be in the remake trilogy. He goes on to say, when we first received that scenario from Nojima-san, specifically that Corel Prison scene that Nomura-san mentioned, I initially thought we could cut this out or change it. I thought certain scenes could be cut, but hearing Nomura-san and Hamaguchi-san opinions on how they want to keep this, I conceded. But when you see it all come together, the final product in that scene, especially the Dyne scene, I think, wow, this is amazing. It's crying worthy. I feel glad it's in there. So the fact that Kitase thought that Dyne and his entire character arc and that Corel Prison stuff could have been cut out is pretty shocking to me, because I think that most fans of Final Fantasy VII remember Dyne and they remember how important of an arc that character has, but it's also important to keep Dyne in the story because he is a parallel to Barret, and what he and Barret go through pretty much shapes who Barret becomes when we first see him in the original game. These are 2 guys who were best friends with one another, and they go through this really tragic attack from Shinra, and they're almost kind of like mirror images of one another, where during that attack with Shinra, they both lose an arm and eventually replace it with, a gun, which is kind of interesting. But the way you can kind of view it is Dyne is almost like the reverse Flash to Barret's Flash. They're so similar to one another, and they both had similar things happen to them, but it's how they handle those things forward that informs who they are as people and shapes who they eventually become. And you see what happens with Barret. He takes that attack and he focuses on getting back at Shinra while also protecting the planet and taking care of Marlene, who, for those of you who don't know, is the biological daughter to Dyne. That's her actual father. But Barret takes her in and adopts her and basically treats her like his own. And then with Dyne, we're led to believe that he does die in that moment because he falls off a cliff and he's never seen again until the party returns back to Corel. Barret finds him and he really sees just how broken he is. And it looks like they're going to hammer that home in Rebirth, specifically looking at the most recent trailer where Dyne is pleading with Barret like, I don't want to see Marlene. I don't want her to see what's happened to me and who I've become. And again, with this really great writing and these performances, I think they're going to take Dyne and make that entire situation with him just even more heartbreaking. And for those of you who don't remember, the way things end between those characters, Barret and Dyne, is through a fight. And Barret ends up winning that fight and Dyne does die. And it is really sad. And again, I think that's probably the second most sad thing to happen in the OG game. And the fact that Kitase thought that wasn't going to be there is kind of odd. But the fact that Nomura and Hamaguchi-san really fought for that to be in there is fantastic. And it also kind of leads back to something that was mentioned in the cover story, where I believe it was Kitase who said that the people on the development staff that were most protective of the source material, the original game, were the younger developers who grew up playing it. So people like Hamaguchi was very much like, no, we have to be faithful to the original game and try to include as much as we possibly can. And a character like Dyne, his entire story arc, it's too important to Barret in the overall story of what the party is dealing with in regards to Shinra. It's too important important to cut that out. It has to be there. Because like I said before, he's almost kind of like a mirror image to Barrett. But they're two people who handle this entire situation very differently. And based on these comments, it seems like there's going to be a lot more situations in Rebirth that really just kind of pull at the heartstrings and just kind of beat us down as players and make us feel all of these incredibly sad, heartbreaking, hopefully not traumatic experiences and emotions. So with that being said, that's the video. Let me know what you guys think in the comments down below. First off, do you think we are going to get that Rebirth demo this month? And what are your overall thoughts on the character of Dyne? Was he someone that really stuck with you from the original game? Was it something that you just kind of glossed over? And do you also feel like his inclusion is absolutely necessary in the remake trilogy? I am Curious Corduroy. I will see you guys in the next video. Please remember to always be excellent to one another.